Thank you very much, Sarah. Of course, by reading out such a long list of issues that I've had to deal with in the past, you've also made clear that I had to deal with them on a very shallow basis. You can either deal, I think, narrow and deep or broad and shallow. I'd also like to make clear that I'm not in any sense an academic, and the remarks I make today will be more practical than theoretical. In terms of the contrast between theoretical and practical, a formative experience for me was when the Foreign Office kindly sent me on the long economics course at the Civil Service College from January to July 1972. This was a somewhat vain effort by the office to turn the literate into the numerate. We did, however, spend several days studying the methodology and results of what I think was the Wilberforce Commission, which settled a miners' strike by giving the miners an award of 24-point-something%. We struggled mightily to find out how they'd done that, comparative wage tables, inflation rates, relative skill levels, and so on, and we came up with our conclusions. Then, at the end of this rather exhaustive process, they brought in the secretary of the committee, who was now a deputy secretary in the Department of Employment, and we went through our methodology and how we derived at roughly comparable figures. And he said, well, well done, lads, but actually that's not how it happened. Yes, we had all this methodology and we came up with a very precise figure of 24-point-something%, but actually what happened was we all sat down together and we said, what is the figure that will get the buggers back to work? And we worked backwards from that. Had to be under 25% because that would destroy the government's incomes policy. By the way, we're talking in an era of when there was very high levels of inflation compared to now, and it couldn't be so low as to cause the miners to dig their toes in. So they started with a conclusion and they worked backwards. And in fact, in working at the UN, I found we often did the same thing. There was a very distinct disconnect between the theory of how things should be done and the way that they were done, and they were done in a more practical and rather basic way. And I think that many political settlements of conflicts are a bit like that. In particular, you have to make sure that there is enough in any settlement to make all the parties feel that they've gained something. We were talking with Fink a little bit earlier about the first South African post-apartheid elections. And there you remember that Buthelezi and Inkatha lost the national election, but they had the consolation of winning the election in KwaZulu-Natal. My impression, which I didn't ask Fink to confirm or deny, was that the ANC had actually encouraged some massaging of the electoral results to make sure that Inkatha won in their home territory of KwaZulu-Natal, because otherwise the feeling was that if they didn't do that, then the election result wouldn't hold in terms of bringing stability and peace to post-apartheid South Africa. I was on Lord Solmes's staff for the transition from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. And again, it was not a level playing field during that transitional period, and we were heavily criticized for allowing the government forces to do things which really weren't strictly in keeping with the Lancaster House Accords, and we were much harder on Mugabe in particular and his party than we were on the bishop and his party, Bishop Misereba and his party during the transition. The reason being that this was not a village cricket match, and we knew that if we gave the whites out leg before wicket, they wouldn't kindly walk back to the pavilion. They would knock the stumps over and abandon play. So there has to be something in it for everybody. I would like to go through how I think it ought to work. But first, I think I should say that, in my experience, political settlements vary very widely in terms of the thoroughness with which they address the underlying issues in a conflict. At one extreme, one could take the peace accords in Guatemala of 2006. In 1996, which brought to an end a civil war in that country, which had lasted for something like 36 years, and had brought untold suffering to the indigenous majority of the population. I started working in the UN at the beginning of March 1997, and I went through the accords with my colleagues, went down to Guatemala, and was really very taken aback by the mismatch between the extremely extensive nature of the accords, which covered everything from the justice system through land reform, education, participation by the Mayan majority in public life in Guatemala, and so on, all of which was to be accomplished in a transitional period of 4 years. Now, actually, it was already evident very, very shortly after the process started that it was utterly impossible to do this in 4 years, that actually it was a project, a blueprint for the transformation of an entire country. It was also evident that the white elite had no intention whatsoever of taking the necessary steps to allow it to happen, let alone within a period of 4 years. They had their privileges, and they didn't see why they should give them up. So that's at one extreme. At another, I would say perhaps that the process in Iraq after the invasion of Iraq in spring 2003 was marked by excessive haste. I think everything that was done was determined by a timetable which was set abroad with the objective of restoring sovereignty to Iraqis, and also, to the extent possible, to withdrawing from control of that country. But the trouble was that the effect, in my opinion, was destabilizing rather than stabilizing. For example, I think that elections were held too soon. Again, Fink and I were talking about this earlier. Iraq had not been a particularly sectarian society before the war, but one of the first acts of the coalition was to set up a governing council in which the 25 places were determined strictly by confessional and ethnic affiliation. So we had to have 13 out of the 25 Shia, because Iraq had a Shia majority, and Ayatollah Sistani, among others, was insistent that that should be the case. We had to have X number of Sunni Arabs, we had to have X number of Kurds, we had to have X number of minorities, whether they were Yazidis or Nestorians, I don't remember. I thought that the work that was done on the transitional constitution was also incredibly rushed. My own belief is that if you're writing a new constitution for a country, you have to allow extensive time for consultation, very wide debate, that you don't firm it up until you've had that very wide debate, because otherwise you make serious problems. And of course, once it's set, it's likely to set the course for a country for a considerable period of years. And in Iraq, again, we were forced into a very rushed timetable, and it ended up with various parties denouncing various elements of the constitution almost before the ink was dry. If I may say something about how I think it ought to be, and what are the requirements for success, I'll talk in a slightly more theoretical way here. I think the first requirement is that there has to be an internal dynamic into which external efforts can link, or to which they can be harnessed. And we've seen plenty of situations in the world where there wasn't an internal dynamic, and where no amount of external effort has really managed to move the situation. I think of South Africa, for example, until the last days of apartheid. It wasn't for lack of effort from outside, it was just there wasn't an internal dynamic. I think of the roadmap, which we in the United Nations, as I was then, drafted, and which subsequently became the roadmap of the UN, the US, the EU, and Russia. I don't think that the government of Prime Minister Sharon had any intention of implementing the roadmap. Stage one, we never got to the end of stage one. Stage one was written as a process which required parallel movement by the parties, and instead the Israelis were successful in turning it into a process which requires sequential movement. And of course that, and where any violation, no matter how minor, by the Palestinian side, moved you back to the beginning. And that was not a process that was going to succeed. I think a second requirement is that you have to make a real effort to understand the issues. And that's where academic and other analysis can be extremely helpful. And when I say you have to understand the situation as it is, I mean that you mustn't caricature the situation, you mustn't stereotype the situation, and you mustn't be moved by external forces into deliberate oversimplification or misrepresentation of the situation. That sounds, very fundamental and very simple, but the trouble is that in the world as it actually is, most countries' foreign policy is heavily influenced by domestic political concerns. Pressure groups are necessary and they are worthy, but they can have a very distorting effect on understanding the situation as it is. Nevertheless, if you don't understand the situation as it actually exists, how can you possibly deal with it successfully? I think a third requirement is to make a careful assessment of who are the players, who are the spoilers, who are those who can be mobilized to support peace, who are those who have an interest in the status quo and don't have an interest in peace. I think it's also absolutely imperative to assess and understand what are the realistic options in any given situation. There may be ideal options, but if they're not achievable, there is absolutely no point in advocating them, and there's even less point in relying on them if you happen to be the peacemaker. I have in the past been very critical about diplomacy on Darfur, and I think that the United Nations too played an unhelpful role in that. I was particularly unhappy when Kofi Annan, at a very early stage in the proceedings, allowed to be slipped into a speech he made to the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, a reference to the need for all options to be explored and pursued, including the use of force. Now, remember, if I remember rightly, this was in 2004, and my immediate question was, one, who is going to do this? Who is going to use force? Not the British, the former colonial power, exhausted, overextended elsewhere. Not the Americans either. Whoever's going to do it, where are they going to be based? And the second problem is that if you start making the other side in a conflict believe that the US cavalry or the British commandos, whoever, are going to come riding to the rescue, you actually tend to harden their position. You tend to make them more adamant because they think they don't need to compromise because someone's going to come and fish their coals out of the fire. So I think that if you're a serious peacemaker, it's the realistic options are the ones that you have to identify, and you shouldn't be shy about advocating those strongly. Again, I found that there is a big difference between feel good and do good. And these days there's a big temptation on democratic politicians to say things that increase the feel good factor. And very often the do good option is unpopular, it's disliked, it's regarded as convention or minimalist or going along with genocide or whatever. I think next you have to be pretty clear in your own mind about whether you're solving a problem or whether you're managing a problem. Are you resolving the conflict or are you containing the conflict and minimizing the conflict? I'm afraid it's not always possible at any given point to solve a problem. Sometimes the best you can do is to contain it, is to minimize it, is to make it manageable. And you need to be very clear about that. There's tons of work available on the concept of ripeness, mutually hurting stalemates, all the rest of it. I'm not saying that if a conflict is not ripe, there's nothing you can do. I think efforts can be made to ripen it. But again, you have to understand that while it's being ripened, you can't solve it. I do think that respect is fundamental. I mean, one of the most welcome things about the new Obama administration is the restoration of respect to foreign policy. The weaker a country is, the more vulnerable a country it is, very often the more important the aspect of respect becomes. If you deal with people from a haughty perspective, if you do not respect them, if you do not find their way of life interesting and worthy of respect, you're not going to be very good at mediating a conflict. I think in the same vein, the importance of patience and persistence cannot be overestimated. I think we're living in a world which is very impatient, has a very short attention span, and needs quick fixes and quick results, and very often these work against stability in the long run. Impartiality is vital. Of course, sometimes it's impossible. Sometimes you have major conflicts. We all know which ones they are, where the mediator is an ally of one of the parties. I think that's unfortunate, but it's the way of the world. So is coordination among external players. I can tell you from direct experience that if you don't have coordination and discipline among the external players, then those players are going to indulge in forum shopping. Okay, we don't like what you're saying, so we'll go to country X or organization Y, and that is the enemy of progress towards a settlement. I think there are. You have to understand also that peace processes don't stand still. At least they don't stand still for very long. They either move forward or they move backwards. And once you get a negotiation going, I think it's very important to drive it forward as hard as it will go. There will always be reverses. There may be interruptions, but it's essential, in my view, if you're serious about solving a political crisis, that you don't allow the thread to break. Sometimes you have to let things down for a bit, and then you understand that the cart is going to slide back down the hill. But sorry, there's an incredible mixed metaphor, but nevertheless, while the cart is sliding back down the hill, don't let the thread break. Perhaps someone can come up with a unified metaphor, but I can't. I think there are legitimate differences in technique about how intrusive you want to be, how much you come up with good ideas. My good friend Lazarus Mbayiwa, when he was doing the Naivasha talks towards the end of the negotiation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, told me that what he did basically was take the two lead negotiators and say, "I'm locking you in a room, and it's not my peace, it's your peace. So you sit down and you stay there until you have solved this particular problem." Other people, other parties sometimes need a lot more by way of encouragement, proposal of ideas, and so on. But the common factor is it has to be their peace, not your peace. And if it's your peace, it's much less likely to last than if it's their peace. Peace is made by the parties. It's not made by outsiders. Now, these are a sort of series of, motherhood wish requirements. I actually think all of them are important, but reality does fall very short. In particular, my belief is that peace processes, peace agreements, often leave very serious issues unsolved and quite often unaddressed. The World Bank has come up with rather depressing figures which show that I think 50% of all peace agreements slide back into some form of conflict within 5 years of the signing of the agreement. I think that's because those underlying issues have not been addressed and are not addressed. I spoke earlier about our lack of stamina. There's a tendency, once a peace agreement is signed, for the international community to kind of rest on its oars and say, well, we've done that job. There's also a terrible tendency for political will and economic support to tail off. You can see with crises, with issues, that they reach a kind of peak of attention and then they start to slide away. And sometimes they slide away at the point when support should actually be intensifying. I think of Afghanistan, for example, as one of those issues. It was evident to me that once the lawyer Jirga was held in Berlin, international support started to slide away, and whereas the international community had a tremendous interest actually in helping the government to extend its authority from the centre to the periphery, that's exactly the point at which it stopped doing that. If you look at the comprehensive peace agreement on Sudan, I went to Khartoum just about at the point when it was being concluded, and met people from the south, but also met opposition from the north, and it was very obvious that that was the end of the beginning, not actually the end of the process, and it should have been followed by a kind of constitutional conference or a national gathering to discuss these things. So I think my time is up, but I wanted to say that quick fixes are no good. I think the modern habit of summits at which differences are papered over, you have to have a success, work against that kind of patient persistence long term. But you must always ask yourself when there's a peace agreement, what is the unfinished business? It's a bit like taking a course of antibiotics. You know, the modern world, you need 2 weeks to get rid of the strep throat. The modern the modern world gives you 5 days worth of antibiotics, maybe 7, and the risk is that the infection will recur because of that failure to see things through to the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much.